don't need it. It's just like having.
Right, well, good afternoon everyone, and a warm welcome from Alliance magazine to everyone here at the Aga Khan Foundation in London and those tuning into the live stream around the world. I'm Charles Keidan, the Executive Editor of Alliance, and I have the privilege of leading you through our inaugural Alliance Year in Philanthropy event here. Alliance is a place for what's happening in philanthropy everywhere, so I'm delighted that you're all here today and listening in around the world. Today's event will include a panel discussion, and then for those of you with us in London here, will also be a workshop looking at the year in philanthropy through the prism of Alliance's 4 special features. Those are on mental health philanthropy, learning from failure, decolonising philanthropy, and our latest issue that's out on crisis and resilience. And then we'll have a drinks reception outside for those of you joining us in person. But I want to start just by thanking our host, the Aga Khan Foundation. It's really good to be back at the Aga Khan Centre here in London. They kindly hosted our 25th anniversary event, and it's great to be with you again. And I've just got to introduce Wajia, who's going to come up just to say a few words on behalf of our host.
Hello, and welcome to the Aga Khan Centre. My name is Rhodri and I work with the Aga Khan Foundation. As many of you will know, we are a charitable organisation who work with vulnerable and marginalised communities in Asia, Africa and the Middle East to improve the quality of life. We're delighted to host this event here today with our good friends Alliance and to welcome you all here to the Aga Khan Centre. The Aga Khan Centre was created as a place for education, knowledge, cultural exchange, and as a space to discuss some of the key development issues shaping the world today. This year has been like no other in terms of the number and scale of humanitarian crises that our organisations are trying to come to terms with and provide effective relief for. From AKF's perspective, we are having to react to crises more right now than in the whole of the last 2 decades combined. Operationally, this is stretching teams and resources and is changing programme priorities and timeframes. This means many of our programmes, be they health, education, early childhood development, or otherwise, are reorientating around humanitarian needs. But the original needs, access to water and sanitation, education or energy, for example, are still prevalent, as well as new urgent ones. This is changing fundraising priorities and opportunities, so being prepared for these changes is more important now than ever. So today's discussion is a timely and significant one. We as an organisation are delighted to be part of this important conversation, and we're thrilled to have you here alongside us. Thank you.
Thank you for those introductory words, and it's a real pleasure to say to be back at the Aga Khan Foundation, but also thanks for what you're doing as a foundation to make sure there's a visibility and spotlight on crises around the world. We have a piece from the Aga Khan Foundation in our new special feature looking at what's happening in Afghanistan, and obviously other crises and conflicts have been perhaps more visible, but it's really important that conflicts per se are considered amongst philanthropists. There's debates about whether funding is always going to where it's needed as opposed to where it's most visible. So thank you for what you're doing in Afghanistan as well. I'd like to just turn the floor briefly to Paul Fleming. Paul is the head of investment solutions and for endowments at Mercer. And Mercer, as you might have known, have had a brilliant presence at so many philanthropy events in recent months and years. They're really doing really important work on encouraging and enabling foundations to be thinking about how they manage their endowments in a sustainable way for the planet as well as for perpetuity. So I want to invite you and thank you as our sponsor today, just to say a few words as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the warm introduction. My name is Paul Fleming. I head up the endowments and foundations business at Mercer. Many of you I know, but many of you I don't. Mercer, we're a global investment advisory organisation. So what do we do? Well, as your sponsor, I'm duty bound to stand here and tell you what we do for 30 seconds. I wanted, before I do that, to say I looked down the guest list I was given it this morning to browse through, and I'm really humbled by the work that you all do as individuals and as organisations. So thank you very much on behalf of people and planet for everything that you do. We have seen unprecedented investment landscape over the last 2 years. Through COVID and now through the cost of living crisis which I really hate the term, the cost of living, the cost of staying alive. And really, it's a true term, the cost of continuing the work of our clients. We advise not-for-profits, endowments, foundations, universities on their asset allocation, manager selection. So ultimately, the strategy that will continue to keep the money flowing through the bank account and continuing ongoing operations. It is more challenging than ever, but there are more solutions and opportunities for not-for-profits through platforms like this to get better advice than ever before. I really do believe we are in an inflection point in the market globally for not-for-profit, generally in investment management. So if there's anything that we can do to support you, to support your organisation, we will always do introductory meetings and the first real sort of kicking off of any advice on a pro bono basis for not-for-profit clients. We don't do that for pensions. So whilst we do get a bit of free advice, there's lots of it in the market. If there's anything we can support you with, do get my details through Alliance. And thank you very much to our guest speakers and to our organiser. It's been a very well-oiled machine. So thank you very much for having us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Paul, and that point about investments being so important is something we're very mindful of at Alliance, and we hope to increase our own coverage of investments, social investments, impact investing, alongside our existing coverage of philanthropy, so look out for more of that in 2023 and beyond. But now I'd like to turn to our panel to look at the year in philanthropy. 2022 has been indeed a tumultuous year for the world, and so too for our field. But to help make sense of it, I'm delighted to be joined by Liubov Rainchuk, who's going to be coming in from, she's from the Zagoriy Foundation in Ukraine, currently based in Croatia, in Zagreb, but joining us today, we hope, from Portugal shortly. Fozia Irfan on my far right here. Fozia is a leading philanthropy practitioner. She's had roles at the Association of Charitable Foundations, at the Community Foundation of Luton, and also currently as a director at BBC Children in Need, as well as running a diversity and inclusion initiatives on behalf of British foundations. Next to Fozia, we have Rhodri Davies, who will be known to many of you through different roles, including former role at CAF as head of policy, but also running the Philanthropism podcast. He's a brilliant philanthropy thinker with impact on debates in philanthropy, not just here in the UK, but around the world. And he's now set up an organisation to promote some of his that thinking about philanthropy, why philanthropy matters. And then finally, we were expecting to have the philanthropist Badr Jafar joining us today from Dubai, but because of a scheduling conflict, he can't be with us. But I'm absolutely delighted to say we now have Joe Switson in his place. Joe is the director of Partners for a New Economy, which is a Swiss-based pooled fund, which we'll be hearing a lot more about pooled fund as part of today's discussions. And some of you might know Jo from her other roles in politics, but I have to say, in my opinion, politics loss is very much philanthropy's game. And delighted to have Jo not just with us today, but infusing her own energy and skills and talents into the philanthropy sector. The panel will be talking about looking at some of the defining issues in 2022 through 4 themes. First, Ukraine and the war in Ukraine and philanthropy's response. Second, the rise and growth of pooled funding and intermediary funds, such as Joe's, the one Joe leads. Third, through a question about the globalisation of conversations about philanthropy, but also the role of philanthropy elites in driving some of those conversations and the extent to which those elites are part of the philanthropy community as we know it. And fourth and finally, we're looking at some new or emerging or in some cases falling or failing philosophies of giving, which have really dominated 2022. And here we'll be talking about trust-based philanthropy, strategic philanthropy, and also effective altruism, one of Rhodri's favourite recent topics. So we'll be hearing a lot more from Rhodri on that. But we're going to start by, I'm going to join the panel now. We're going to start by talking about Ukraine. And if I am and can be joined by Liubov, hopefully we'll get her on the screen now. So as I say, Liubov Rainchuk is the Deputy Director of the Zagoriy Foundation, which is a family foundation in Ukraine. She's in and out of Ukraine a lot, but joining us today from Portugal. Welcome, Liubov. If we can get some sound for you.
Self on the screen.
Welcome, we can hear you now.
Yeah, Hi everyone, and I'm so delighted that you remembered all my movies during this time we did in Portugal and back then in Zagreb. Yeah.
Well,
Thank you for remembering that.
Well, we'll talk about movements and the challenges of movements in a moment. But take us inside the Zagoriy Foundation in February this year, on the brink of the war with Russia. You've had to shift your philanthropy onto a wartime footing. I mean, what happened, and what happened within the foundation, and what did you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, the funny thing is that right before the full-scale invasion, we were about to have the final agreement of our final annual budget and all of our programs. And then when the war broke out, we had to restart the whole process from the scratch. So what basically happened, as Charles mentioned, we are a family foundation. So before the war, we used to operate as using family donated money. And it was, you know, the easy way to provide the assistance and support we wanted to do. But when the war broke out, we realized we started to find out what the current situation is. And this thing was that the family decided to to shift to support the army and to support our defense system. So we faced the situation where we had something left on our account and that's it. And we need to work more on what to do, how to operate, can we save the team, and is there any other options for us to do. Luckily, we worked a lot to provide on communications, basically. So we had our site on in English, we had some communications and connections with organizations abroad. So we were lucky enough to receive some support from our partners, those ones who we knew before the war or the new one, basically like Global Giving or Philanthropy helped us a lot to build new connections.
You mentioned Philanthropy, for those that aren't familiar, that's a European umbrella body for philanthropy. That they set up a platform, right, to support philanthropic donations across Europe.
Mm-hmm. And what happened with our activities and how we started to do once again. So we got this support, so we had a chance to save a team and even to expand some of our activities. We decided from the very beginning that we would start working on supporting grassroots organizations because there was a huge seduction to come to humanitarian aid, but we realized that we have expertise in other areas and it will be better to focus on this. So we started with providing grant support to our partner that we used to work before and the new one, and as for now we organized 3 contests, 3 grant calls, and supported more than 30 organizations, and we provided them with organizational support, capacity building, and also we started some of educational programs to provide them not only money but also skills, how to be more resilient, how to be more stable, how to work in these new work conditions. So we mentored them and we helped them. And also one of our main activities before the war was research the culture of giving and the culture of philanthropy in Ukraine. So we did another research during this summer, how Ukrainians responded to war and what are new trends in giving. And this was, so we organically somehow went to the point where we continued to do what we did before, but using different methods. So we wanted to build the culture of giving, we still do it, but before the war, we wanted to provide more information. We did informational campaigns, we provided more info on that, we started to work with influencers, we did research, the necessary information and assistance they might need. And another point we started to work on was trust-based philanthropy and trust in philanthropy institutions at all. It is quite low in Ukraine, and we are working to promote it.
Thank you. We'll talk a bit more about trust-based philanthropy later on. Just one brief comment. You mentioned at the start that the family supported the army, the family philanthropists. Just talk me briefly through what that involves. That's a kind of philanthropy that's not unprecedented, but certainly unusual.
Foreigners, the war in the country is something that you cannot fully understand if you don't have it and if you didn't have that experience. So as for Ukrainians, supporting army means supporting Ukraine, means supporting independence, and means supporting our resilience, because whenever we have someone that save our borders, they save us and they keep helping operating what we are doing in the country. If this will, disappear, break, if we lose, there will be no any problems as we can talk about right now. But the family, I want to make this comment, they continue to support the foundation. It's just we expanded our activity that much that it is not enough what we did before. So they provide, for example, this year it was nearly half of the annual budget, and we'll see how it goes the next year, because they pledged to continue giving and to continue to support what we started back in 2015.
Thank you, Luba. And clearly there's going to be ongoing needs around reconstruction if and we pray when the war is over. But let's zoom out and look at the international context. I'm going to bring in Rhodri here. What have you made of the international philanthropy community's response to Russia's invasion, and some of the crowdfunding also that's been evident?
Well, the philanthropic response has been, as you would imagine, I guess there was some caution at first about how to deploy those resources because of the kind of inherently political elements of doing it. And I think a lot of the response was focused more on addressing things that more neatly sit within the remit of philanthropy and civil society, so the kind of the human cost of the war. The thing that I think is fascinating, and as was being said there, is the idea of the purchase of weaponry and direct support for the army itself as something that is a kind of an appropriate focus for philanthropy. And I think what's fascinating about that is if all we had these days was still institutional philanthropy that is intermediated by the sorts of organisations that we've long known that are tied to certain legal requirements and definitions of what is or isn't charitable, that probably wouldn't happen. But because that is being disintermediated by the fact that people can now directly appeal to other individuals elsewhere in other countries through crowdfunding platforms, and payments can be made via apps or via cryptocurrency and these kinds of things, actually people are able to make that appeal and say, well, what we need on the ground is money to buy weapons. And if people in other countries say, fine, you know what you need, I'm happy to give you money for that, that's something that's able to take place. I think it's really interesting whether it kind of challenges the boundaries of what we understand of, as philanthropy.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you. And Joe, if I can bring you in here. Alongside the humanitarian costs that we all have heard about in the news, there's been massive economic problems triggered by what's happened in the conflict outside of Ukraine, particularly with the disruption of food and energy supplies. And how's what's happening affecting your thinking about the role philanthropy can play in shaping an economy that can withstand these kinds of shocks?
Yeah, I think when you think about the Ukraine crisis and the Russian invasion, it's really on two levels. And so, on one level, you hear Liubov talking, and you're talking about people where it's literally life and death, where basic access to energy is in doubt, and indeed whether people are going to survive the next day. There's a kind of intensity and an urgency for the people in that country, where there will always be that response from philanthropy and indeed from individuals who are hoping to try to ameliorate some of the worst impacts, while obviously hoping that the war ends soon. But then when you take the second level of what is that knock-on effect, then it has really, I think, deepened and highlighted many of the vulnerabilities of our current economy, particularly around energy security. The reliance, particularly across Europe, on Russian fossil fuels has been significant, and arguably has been a vulnerability for a very long time, and yet hasn't been a priority. And of course, it's not just energy. We are also seeing, in terms of the food production within Ukraine and the challenges of getting that food out, the impact that's had on food prices within the global markets, and indeed that access to food in many, many countries, even those that are actually quite far from Europe. So, this kind of issue of resilience, I mean, there's a lot of things that need to change about our economy, but I think we've come from a period in the last few decades where particularly the kind of Western neoliberal model of the economy has been about, maximising efficiency. If you can cut your costs, that's always the best thing to do. And that you do often at the price of resilience. And I mean, we saw it in the pandemic with, PPE, protective equipment stocks had been run down in many places because, that was cuts, that was efficiency savings apparently. And suddenly when you needed it, it wasn't there. And you see the same thing when it comes to energy and food. And have there been thoughts about how resilient are your supply chains? Can you get access? And so some of the very obvious solutions, which have been staring us in the face for many years with the climate crisis, about trying to make sure that we only use energy when we need to use it, so we're actually insulating people's homes so that they don't just leak heat. That helps save people money. It's good for the environment. It's now good for national security too. And there have been some countries that have been doing that really well. Italy's has had some great stuff. But philanthropy actually, is in an ideal position to be supporting and funding some of the people who are thinking about this long-term future. What are the challenges going to be? How is the world moving? How does a society, and societies right across the world, need to react? And of course, yes, governments can do some of that, academia can do some of that, but I think philanthropy is just really well placed with its funding that doesn't have the same strings attached, if you like, as say the hoops that a government must jump through to justify spending on something. I think philanthropy is really well placed to think about the future.
Now, again, just before I bring Fozia in, just to ask you briefly, just how far should philanthropy go in helping to bring about those necessary changes to the economy, particularly when there's groups of protesters, non-violent civil disobedience protesters, agitating for change, which is not always popular, but can be backed by precisely the risk-taking that philanthropy has got the space to do? How far should it go?
Well, I mean, I think each philanthropy organisation will have a different appetite, but is it okay for philanthropy to be involved in supporting movements for change? Absolutely. And if you think about how great strides forwards have been taken over history, whether it's been, winning things like, women's right to vote, or winning equality in terms of things like equal marriage, these types of social change have not always been popular with everybody at the beginning, but over time you have seen these movements, gain support, and protest is often an important and necessary tactic. I mean, we're sitting here in London, 100 years or so after in the UK the first woman had the chance to vote. I mean, if you look at the tactics of the suffragettes, more than a century ago, I mean, they weren't purely, sitting there primly and asking nicely, were they?
So a call for philanthropy to be bolder, which of course means taking risks. And one of the issues we'll be talking about is our special feature on learning from failure, and risk and failure are obviously intimately connected. And there's a question about the extent to which philanthropy is doing or could do precisely more of some of the things you described. But let's turn to Fozia and community foundations. Obviously you're not working in one now, but community foundations, particularly I'm thinking the Community Foundation in Northern Ireland, has some incredible experience and expertise around conflict and managing conflicts across divides. So just going from beyond the Ukraine context to just thinking about the role of communities, community-based philanthropy, and anticipating and resolving conflict. Perhaps you can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's if you think about conflict in three stages: pre-conflict, conflict itself, and post-conflict. I think philanthropy has a huge role to play in all of those three dimensions. So pre-conflict, when there are tensions in society, when there are divisions, when there is, civil unrest which hasn't turned into conflict, that's where I think actually philanthropy should play a stronger role, rather than waiting for the escalation and the conflict to occur. And I think sometimes philanthropy has been a little cautious about entering that space, because conflicts by their nature are not simplistic. I mean, if you think about the Northern Ireland conflict, that's very complex, it's very nuanced. There's a huge amount of history there in terms of who do you support, who do you not support, who do you fund, who do you not fund. As a philanthropist, how can you maintain that neutral objectivity that is so fundamental to building credibility, to building... So if you look at Community Foundation for Northern Ireland, if you look at Atlantic Philanthropies, Atlantic Philanthropies and Community Foundation for Northern Ireland, for me, were fundamental in peace building. We would not be where we are without those huge philanthropic institutions doing what they're doing. That's not just in terms of money and grant making, but in terms of soft power, in terms of influencing, in terms of bringing political parties together, all of those things. So I would actually like philanthropy to think of itself in a much more expansive way, because to me, and I'll probably keep coming back to this theme, but philanthropy is power. It's just about how do you use that, where do you use it, how can you use it in a way which is not anti-democratic. And I know we'll talk about that later.
Well, yes, and that actually, thank you, and that brings us on maybe to the next topic, on the rise of intermediaries and pooled funding, which is some way of diluting some of that philanthropic power. But we'll keep very much Ukraine in mind as we think about some of these topics and conflicts in general, but I want to make sure we get through the four items on our agenda today to look at 2022 through. So there's been a surge of what some have called capital aggregation in pooled funds managed by intermediaries, rather than foundations building their own institutions. So if you look at the feminist funds around the world that have been backed by Mackenzie Scott, London Funders, which has just announced a 100 million 10-year fund to promote equality across London, City Bridge Trust amongst the funders there. The fund's called Propel, you can look at that. Joe's fund, which we'll talk about in a minute, Partners for New Economies. So there does seem to be something happening where there's a trend towards a growing desire for funders to pool resources to have collective impact. So Joe, in your recent experience in philanthropy over the last couple of years, have you seen this as something that's been a defining feature of philanthropy from your vantage point, working with who you're, maybe start by saying who you're working with,
Sure.
and how you work.
Okay, so to give you some context then, Partners for a New Economy is a pooled fund made up of 7 foundations. It was initially founded in 2015 by Oak, Marisla, Mava and KR foundations, mainly coming from an environmental perspective of trying to, how can we transform the economic system, which they had concluded was the Ford Foundations and the Midjar Network. And the kind of the impetus behind that was really about trying to do something bold. And I think there's a sort of safety in numbers, right? If you're doing something which hasn't been done before, you're wanting to learn about it, and so having different perspectives around the table really enriches the discussions that you have. There's sort of perceived that it's a lower risk if it's not all being done by one foundation, but actually you can pool the resources and learn together. And I wonder if, and probably others are better placed to talk about to the extent this is a trend. I'm very aware I'm on a panel with people, and my experience in philanthropy is 2 years, and I'm very aware I'm with others who have very long experience in the field. But I wonder if there is something about the sort of increasing uncertainty of the world that we're living in. And I don't think that's going to go away. We've sort of had crisis after crisis. We've had the increasing environmental crises. We've had the pandemic. We've now got the inequality crisis is very live, both between countries and indeed within countries, with the energy and other costs really bringing that to a head. And actually, if we look ahead, some people call this a polycrisis. There's going to be more, right? We know there will be more pandemics. I mean, we sort of knew that there was going to be a pandemic, but we'd kind of turned a bit of a blind eye to that. We know that there's going to be increasing extreme weather events from climate. We know that and by the way, when you look at the planetary boundaries, climate is only one of 9, and it isn't even the one that is most exceeding the safe limits in the planetary boundaries. So when you start to look at the species loss, the biodiversity, the use of chemicals, the flows, water access, there are going to be more crises, and I think there's the famous proverb, isn't there? Proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. I think that's probably what's behind the trend.
Thank you. And Rhodri, does that resonate with you in terms of your sense of the increased amount of collaboration we're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we certainly are seeing it as a trend. I mean, I'd say the idea that collaboration is a good thing to do is obviously not new, and I think the thing to me that seems fascinating about it, and it goes to an extent to what Fozia was saying about philanthropy being inherently about power, is that the shift towards pooled funds seems to me as though it's both an acknowledgement of the power that philanthropy has, but also an acknowledgement of the limitations of that power, in the sense that individual funders, particularly when they come to funding grassroots organisations and social movements, historically, the problem has always been there's such a mismatch of scale that even when you're well-intentioned, you inevitably skew the activity of what you're funding, because your own kind of risk appetite and profile and what you think is important shapes that, and there's a kind of process of movement capture or co-optation that takes place, even if it's unintentional. But equally, I think the desire to work together is an acknowledgement that the model we might have had of the sort of philanthropic lone saviour, don't worry, the philanthropist's here or the individual foundation's here, and I will solve this complex, multifaceted problem on my own, is obviously nonsense and always has been. But the acknowledgement that actually none of these problems are going to be solved by any one person or institution or even any one sector, and so it's absolutely necessary that we do find ways of people collaborating, bringing resources together and trying to address problems in a sort of meaningful, systemic way. So, I mean, I think it's a hugely positive trend.
In a way, the development of an emergence and growth of pool funds is exerting some kind of democratic pull on philanthropy. But does that pull have its limits? Does it maybe, Fozia, incline us to think that because intermediaries are managing the funds of elite foundations, they're somehow giving the appearance of devolving power, but not actually doing it fully? How far, is it a double-edged element, these pool funds? What do you think?
I mean, with pooled funds, the fact that they're pooled funds does not in of itself make it more democratic. It just means essentially that you've put your money together with other funders and foundations. You may have exactly the same systems, processes, decision making, etc., as you would acting alone. But I do think, as Rhodri was alluding to, I think there is power in recognising the fact that we always have been, but we are particularly now dealing with large-scale, complex, global problems, and therefore we need funders and foundations to work together. But I think this is also a reaction and a response to the fact that there's a movement, there's a journey towards recognising that we should be funding movements, not institutions. And again, recognising that no one institution, no one charity can solve the problem of poverty or solve the problem of patriarchy or racism. Actually, and this is where I think philanthropy gets exciting, is when we start to work in collaboration to fund movements, recognising that we aren't the problem solvers, but we can provide power through forms of money and etc. to enable that to happen.
That's interesting. So pooled funds might create a safety mechanism for foundations to go where they otherwise wouldn't go, into the funding of movements. And while you were speaking, I saw Luba over there nodding her head, and you've been, had to re-pivot into an intermediary of a different kind as you've tried to broker conversations both with civil society and government where you are, but also with the international philanthropy community, with Philia and others. So how have you, at Zagoriy Foundation, found yourself in this position as being an important intermediary in essentially a conflict zone? How have you navigated that?
Yeah, thank you for this question. You may have noted that, but I was not in all the previous dialogues because collaborations, community, listening to what is happening on the ground, it's something that we believe in and what we are trying to do. So, for example, being an intermediary for us from the very beginning was the idea we will not push our agenda on what to do and how to provide assistance. None of our calls was aimed at, for example, humanitarian aid or doing this or that, whatever we thought might be useful, even though we had our, thoughts how to better provide this support. But we were trying to give our potential grantees opportunity to give us information what is needed on the ground. The problem with all the waterfall money, from the up to the very down, is that on every level there is decision makers that makes you think what they want you to think, and that leads to some kind of professional grantees where they know how to apply, what to do, and then there is no capacity building in other organizations, there is no stability, there is no stable civil society in this or that country. So from what we were trying to do, as I mentioned, we were trying to learn what is needed, and then we also learned how organizations are trying to get this support, what is important to them. And what we learned is flexibility is something that everyone was trying to talk really loud, and they wanted to have less procedures, more impact, because you spend from 1 to 2 months to apply, then 1 to 2 months to get those money, and then reporting and everything. So they were trying to get this procedure easier. Another point with cooperation from local organizations or grassroots organizations and internationals is this trust-based philanthropy and how you can prove that you're worth it. So these check points of knowing that you are not some kind of fraud makers or whatever, you need to do a lot of administrative work. And from what we've learned from the organizations that are working on the ground, they don't have enough money for translating the document that someone requires. They do not have time to provide all the documents or procedures or politics, because they are mostly trying to concentrate on help, and they basically addressing the issues that they face. And this is, from our side, we are trying to connect them and to build those bridges between international community and international donors that have the ability to provide support and to help, but also to show them what is happening there. So when we do our report and provide the information on philanthropy and what is the current situation, we are trying to show the way, and we are trying to show how we work. We have a lot of procedures, but they are more or less understandable for those organizations that we work with. But every donor has its own procedure, and for us it's not difficult to get into this. For someone, it's the whole way new process, and they do not have resources for that.
Thank you for explaining a bit more about your role as an intermediary, navigating, connecting, translating, and all the things that good intermediaries can do. And obviously you're doing it in an extreme context. Well, I want to move to the third topic. There's actually two topics about the globalisation of philanthropy and also the role of elite philanthropy. And this year we've seen extraordinary growth in the development of philanthropy infrastructure, by which we mean umbrella bodies, academics, thinkers like Rhodri, consultancies, but also a growth in the global south. And we now at Alliance magazine have for some time talked about what we call a self-consciously global philanthropy sector. But to what extent does that actually exists? So going to Liubov first, I first met you and met your colleagues at the EFC meeting in Vienna when you were trying to make Ukrainian philanthropy more visible in the pre-war context. I mean, how have you felt part of a global philanthropy community, not just this year but over recent years?
Sorry, can you please repeat
Sure.
because I lost the connection.
Sure, no problem. So do you feel part of a global philanthropy conversation, partly as a result of obviously what's happened with war in your country, but just generally in terms of conversations you're having with peers outside of your country about philanthropy? Do you feel part of a philanthropy community?
Yes, we feel that because we started to work on our international, to be a part of international community a long time before the full-scale war. So we knew the background, we knew the landscape, we knew some of the players. We attended some conferences, we attended these working groups, whatever. So it was not the, and when all this happened, it was easier for us to be, more with a strong voice. We had something to advocate. We had something we wanted to share and to show to the international audience. So, and they were really kind and warm. We were warmly welcomed during that time. And we had the stage to share our voice and to share what is happening and what are the obstacles that we or philanthropy in Ukraine face. So for us, it was something that was more or less organically. But talking in front of, as for some of our partners or grantees, they do not know how to do that. First thing, they do not know English in that way that they can express themselves and they can be the part of the community. The other point is that their annual budgets do not allow them to be the part of the events or to have these networking events where they can do something. And also, they are more focused on operations rather than communication. And during our, we have educational courses, mentoring, and whatever, and we're trying to make them believe that what you do is not less important than how you tell and how you give the information to the audience, to the potential donors. Reporting is as much important as your projects or your giving support. And so we, the problem is that we do not have this umbrella organization for philanthropy organizations in Ukraine at all. So we have one small organization, for example, for community foundations, we have those associations. But as for the association which unites philanthropy institutions in Ukraine, there is no such. It was in the process of reconstruction just before the war, and when the war broke out, nobody cared about, working on that.
Well, yeah, philanthropy infrastructure can seem like an obscure topic for some, but of course it's essential to underpinning the kind of conversations, mechanisms, funding that happens. And I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is played out in the evolving stages of growth in philanthropy sectors around the world, both within Europe but also across the world and between different countries. So it's very interesting to get a sense of where things are there. And what about you, Joe? Maybe briefly, if you can say you're a relative newcomer to the philanthropy sector. How easy has it been to find your way around the language and the community of philanthropy that you've stepped into when you arrived in philanthropy land 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, it was really interesting even when I was applying for the role at Partners, and I was sort of doing my research, and what I was really sort of looking for was like, a list somewhere, a website that we list all the foundations and, what they spent and what they focused on. And, that didn't feel like too much to ask, but obviously I didn't find it. And it would be incredibly helpful. So I think my experience of philanthropy is it's quite opaque. It can be quite hard to find your way around and to understand. I think that's probably been harder in the pandemic, and I find that when things have been opening up and more events have been taking place in person, like here today and others that I've been to, the ability to actually meet people, I mean, there is just something that Zoom doesn't replace. But it's not necessarily the easiest sector to get around. Of course, Alliance magazine does a great job of helping to provide a window into the different debates.
We certainly try, as I know that you do, Rhodri. So just from your vantage point, and maybe we'll turn just to the question of elites and philanthropy elites. So do you see a kind of global philanthropy conversation happening? And do you think there's a difference between the conversations happening in rooms like Alliance and with its community and with professional philanthropy sectors, and then the conversation happening amongst philanthropists? We certainly try to feature them as much as we can across our pages, but sometimes it's almost like they breathe a different air and can inhabit a different world. So do you think there's a global conversation? Is it happening in different ways?
I think there are clear common themes that you can find, and I think, I try in the work that I do always to step back a bit and try and put all of the thinking about philanthropy in context, both by looking at what's happening globally. And I think the basic idea of people wanting to be generous towards other people is pretty fundamental. That's instantiated in all kinds of different ways, in different sorts of cultures and traditions of giving around the world. And I think we have to be very careful about not assuming that when new cultures of philanthropy flourish elsewhere in the world, they're inherently or necessarily going to look like the models we've got in the UK or the US. I think that would be incredibly kind of egotistical. So I think, but fundamentally they exist, and when you look backwards, kind of historically, there are themes that just sort of run cyclically through the whole of philanthropy, and we've been talking about them for hundreds of years, even if we occasionally forget that we have. I think where we're at the moment in terms of philanthropy is fascinating, because it feels like a moment where critical thinking about philanthropy and sort of self-reflection about philanthropy has become quite mainstream, thanks to a number of sort of high-profile books over the last few years and more kind of awareness in the mainstream debate about some of the challenges that philanthropy poses, as well as the good points about it. What feels to me fascinating is I think there is a bit of a divide between people perhaps who are the philanthropoids, so the people who work in philanthropy and sort of manage the money, and some of the people who own the money, where I feel like those who work in it have kind of internalised some of that criticism and feel it very strongly, some of these issues about how philanthropy relates to inequality, power asymmetries, whether philanthropy is anti-democratic. And they're sort of trying to do their best within the world of philanthropy to shift philanthropy towards the best version of it. Whether all of the people who hold the wealth are also engaging with those debates, I don't know. I would just say that one thing I have found fascinating is it does feel as though there is a new breed of philanthropist whose starting point is, yes, I take on board all of that, and when I do philanthropy, it's going to be in the context of acknowledging, the different challenges with power and inequality and democracy. And so I sort of feel as though there is potentially a sort of new breed of philanthropist out there that reflects all of this thinking.
Could you, before we bring Fozia in, just say a little bit more about that intriguing phrase, the best version of philanthropy? So what, just if you had to summarise that, what would that look like? I mean, you touched on some of those points, but...
I have my own view, as everybody else in the room does, about
what is that?
Well, I think a version of philanthropy that acknowledges that by acknowledging that it has the potential to be anti-democratic, and so as far as possible, philanthropy itself should strive to be more democratic by embracing participatory methods, being as transparent as possible, so that you know where money's come from, where it goes. One that seeks to move power as well as financial resources towards the communities that would have traditionally been seen as the recipients of philanthropy, and lots of other things. I think shifting away from a mindset where the donor has all of the power to dictate what the problems are and how best to solve them, to one where they essentially have some humility and see their role as passing over resources to the people who probably understand those problems better and have an idea about the solutions. I could bang on for quite a while about what my views are on how philanthropy could be better, but that's just a sort of flavour.
Thank you. I'm sure that would resonate with a lot of Alliance readers. And Fozia, I mean, it's sometimes said that philanthropy does too often reflect the elites rather than the streets, and you've been involved in efforts to diversify philanthropy. Maybe been frustrated in some of those efforts, but it is the frustrations because actually it's an immutable feature of philanthropy, or is it actually a bug? Can we really sincerely believe that that efforts to shift power in the way that Rhodri kind of described can actually happen, as apart from around the edges? I mean, how far? I mean, and what are you doing at Children in Need about? Have you been doing? I know you've got a new strategy there about precisely this.
Well, precisely this, but I think you have to believe and you have to have hope that we can shift philanthropy. Although the greatest catalyst for shifts in power has been the increase in scrutiny on our sector. So the books, the foundation practice rating, which actually without the consent of foundations, ranks and rates foundations according to diversity, transparency, I think that was a huge catalyst for a lot of foundations to say, hang on, somebody is watching what we're doing and we need to...
But most of them got Ds for diversity, didn't they?
Exactly, but then at least it started the conversation, because before that, where was the accountability? Where was the motivation to act? Whereas actually, if you're a foundation and you've got a D for diversity, your trustees are going to ask you, why have we got a D for diversity? Somebody's going to pick up on it. Your grantees are going to notice. I think the biggest motivator for foundations and for philanthropy is actually scrutiny. It would be great if we had our own self-imposed standards of excellence, that we motivated ourselves according to them, but I don't think we're at that stage. And I think shifting power, I do see green shoots. I think the participatory grant-making movement is incredibly important. I think movements like Charity So White, where different issues are being brought to the fore, are incredibly important. With us at BBC Children in Need, I've been there 2 years, and we weren't known as the most flexible or Rhodri's laughing, or quickest of funders. And so when I came in, one of the things we looked at was the diversity of our portfolio. And that's incredibly important because we are the BBC, and it's incredibly important to the BBC that we reflect and represent the communities, diverse communities across the UK. So we've undertaken a new grant-making strategy. I would like to say that we have really shifted power. We have really thought about being more flexible, giving the types of grants that organisations have wanted. So we did a huge consultation exercise. An organisation said we need core grants. We want unrestricted. For various reasons, we couldn't do unrestricted grants, but we've gone as far as we could in recognising that we need to support infrastructure, we need to support capacity building. And there's still a lot more work to do. I think my fear is that foundations and funders retract from this space because there isn't as much scrutiny as there was, say, 2 years ago with the murder of George Floyd, etc. There's a huge amount of activity then, which I think has slightly abated, and that concerns me. But I do see green shoots of movement, and I think scrutiny is the biggest motivator.
It's encouraging. I mean, it's interesting you bring up the point of race and also the need for scrutiny, and I'm going to resist the temptation to ask about royal philanthropy and foundations in that context now. Perhaps we'll come back to that. But you did talk about core funding, and that does bring us on to the question, the fourth topic that I wanted to raise, which is about philosophies of giving. And two of the biggest that have been in debate in 2022 are trust-based philanthropy, which we'll talk about in a moment, but now first up, effective altruism. So trust-based philanthropy has been on the rise. The philosophy of effective altruism has taken a huge battering, and there's no one probably better to talk about that than Rhodri, who's been writing quite a lot about that. Can you just briefly just explain what has been happening in what is effective altruism for those that don't know? What has been happening and why is it so significant for our field, if at all?
I'll try and keep it brief, and I'm not sure people in the effective altruism movement would say I'm the best person to be talking about it. No, I mean, I have a funny relationship with effective altruism because actually I think there's a lot to admire in many ways about it as a movement and as a way of thinking, and at the very least I think it challenges us to understand why it is that we don't necessarily agree with everything that it says, and if you can't answer those questions at the very least, I think you have to sort of shine a spotlight on yourself. I mean, for anyone who doesn't know, it's a movement that kind of came out of academic philosophy. It basically proposes the idea that when it comes to giving and doing good in the world, we need to put aside any of our own views as donors about what causes to give to and be totally agnostic about that and focus only on the idea that you do the most good with the resources available to you. What that means, of course, is slightly up in the air, but the interpretation has generally been one that's vaguely utilitarian, so it's kind of trying to maximise the amount of well-being for the greatest number of people. I mean, what's happened recently has centred around the spectacular implosion of Sam Bankman-Fried, who's a big crypto billionaire, and he was very prominent as an effective altruist himself and a big funder of the movement. And the reason it's so damaging, apart from the fact that lots of the money that was promised to these organisations has suddenly disappeared in puffs of, you know, cryptographic smoke, is that the fact that he was an effective altruist is not incidental to this story. The narrative that most people have taken on board is that the reason he went into crypto in the first place was because he bought into the idea of earning to give, which is one of the slightly counterintuitive ideas of effective altruism is actually you're wasting your time by going and working for a charity or working in the world of philanthropy. You'd be better off going and working in a hedge fund or running a crypto exchange, making filthy amounts of cash and then giving it to carefully vetted EA-endorsed charities. And he bought into that to the extent a lot of people think that he was so taken with the kind of consequentialist idea that the only thing that's important is the ends, and the means by which you get there perhaps can, you know, be kind of fudged, that led towards poor behaviour that eventually became outright fraud. And so a lot of people feel as though actually EA is culpable because it provided the intellectual and moral framework that allowed him to do what he did with his company, and that subsequently kind of resulted in the collapse of it. So I think EA itself as a movement is doing a lot of soul searching. My very quick take, and you can get the longer version, the drinks afterwards if you like, is the movement will probably splinter. I think there was already a dividing line between people who focused on the original version of EA, which was very much about let's deal with problems in the here and now like malaria and low-cost solutions like bed nets and deworming pills, and a version that subsequently emerged, which is bought into the idea that we need to focus on the far long-term future and that actually we should be putting all of our resources into addressing things like the potential risk of AI achieving superhuman intelligence. And I think there was already a lot of tension in the movement about that shift, and I suspect it is that fault line which will see it split into different things.
Thank you. That's a brilliant summary and a very interesting prediction about the fault lines for effective altruism in 2023 and beyond. And just before we turn to all of you and questions, if we can, from the live stream, just want to ask Fozia questions about trust-based philanthropy. So if EA was really focused more on the ends, justifying the means, you know, trust-based philanthropy, as popularised by Mackenzie Scott, was all about giving out unrestricted funding, multi-year funding, not bothering people with application forms or reporting, just trusting beneficiaries, particularly those centred around progressive organisations, knew best, and you could actually just get the money out to them and prove that you don't need over-professionalised foundation models. So what's your... has that influenced what you've done at Children in Need?
Absolutely, but I think there's a deeper question here about whether, you know, how we make grants and whether philanthropy is an art or a science. And I sort of land somewhere in between in terms of, you know, really advocating for trust-based philanthropy, because not only do I believe it's more effective when you hand over power to those communities that you're working with to make decisions about that funding, but also there's a really fundamental principle which is about a lot of our funding has to do with poverty and inequality, and a lot of the sources of our funding are directly linked to that poverty and inequality. So, you know, if we think about capitalism and where philanthropy originated, some would argue that actually we need to move towards recognising injustice, and our philanthropy should be based on that rather than charity. And if you take that, you know, there's that famous saying about charity can't do the work of justice. And I think if you look through a prism of justice, then you will recognise that communities are best placed to make decisions about where assets are leveraged, where they're distributed, and there's a fundamental disconnect between you as a philanthropist or you as a philanthropic organisation believing that you have the knowledge and expertise to make decisions about people who live very different lives to you and who face very different challenges to you. So to me, I think that's really fundamental. I think it has influenced what we've done at BBC Children in Need. You know, I'm actually in favour of unrestricted grant making, but for various reasons, because of the way that our funding model works at BBC, we weren't able to go that far. But we try as much as we can to give a huge amount of freedom to our grantees. We're also, and I think this is another thing which is really important for philanthropy, we're involving the children and young people that we work with in our decision making, and we're trying to do it in as a really thoughtful and considered way as possible, so that it's not an extractive relationship, which is quite often what happens in philanthropy as well. But I would say it's a journey. We're probably at the very start of that journey, and there are many foundations who've done a lot more than us, but then also hopefully many that will follow the path that we're going on.
Thank you, and it's interesting to hear you using words like participatory grant making, involving young people and shifting power as the route to justice in philanthropy. But with that, thank you all. We want to open up the space and make sure there is time. There is 25 minutes for questions and discussion, and perhaps you can raise your hand and say what your organisation is, and Amy here is going to bring mics over. And just while we do that, I should have mentioned, if you haven't already found it, the Wi-Fi you can find in your event pack for those that are still searching for it. Sorry I didn't mention that earlier. Can see Kathy with a hand up here. Is there any other hands up? And Shanali, and we'll take 3 at a time. So one more. Take you over there. Hi. Should we go with you first, and then we'll go to Shanali and then Cassie?
Thank you. I don't know if I should stand up or not. But,
yeah, stand up and introduce yourself. Welcome.
Brilliant. Yeah, so I'm Milena from London Funders, and you talked about kind of philanthropy funding social or protest movements. But those kind of movements, I'm thinking about Extinction Rebellion, for example, don't necessarily have the same governance structures as a charity. Have you seen good examples, or do you have lessons to share about how to fund movements?
Great question, thank you. Shanali? Wait, the microphone should be on its way to you.
Thank you so much. Is this on? I can shout too. No? Okay, doesn't matter. But yeah, so my question is actually probably a little more for Rhodri. I'm Shanali Banerjee from the Center for Strategic Philanthropy at Cambridge. And so obviously our job is pretty much exclusively to do research on philanthropy. So not coming necessarily from a donor perspective or a grantee perspective. I'm very interested in what's happening right now with effective altruism, because previously my academic work and a lot of my professional work has been involved with critiquing the concept of philanthrocapitalism, right? So that took off in the last decade. And so effective altruism, in part from my perspective, is sort of a new iteration of what philanthrocapitalism was for a long time. Then people started very rightfully poking holes in philanthrocapitalism, and it started devolving a lot of trust in the sector. And I see the same thing happening with effective altruism, is that as much as it should be sort of taken down a peg and reassessed, and Sam Bankman-Fried is a perfect example of how it can all go wrong. But it actually then, for the philanthropy sector as a whole, kind of keeps the status quo where it is, which is obviously what we're all trying to talk about shifting. So when you have these new kind of really trendy, buzzy topics come up, and some particularly famous rich people getting really involved with those topics, when they eventually go pear-shaped, what happens then for those of us who are actually trying to shift philanthropy for the better through trust-based participatory practices, etc. So I guess I'm thinking about that a lot these days. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, and over to you, Cassie. Welcome.
I'll try and shout as well. I don't want to stand up, but that's all right. I was just interested in like how we sort of talk about bringing scrutiny around. Hello?
There we go.
We talk about bringing scrutiny to things that are very important around racial justice and shifting power. And like that's going to be a lifetime's work for all of us. And I sometimes think with some of the participatory grant making movement and some of that shifting power work, we can also tend to be almost like a chessboard, shifting power from one group to the next. But are we also bringing scrutiny are we also changing the chessboard? And I would love to hear like what the panel what the panel thinks about how we can bring more accountability to the kind of ambition to really fundamentally shift systems and change the chessboard. Shifting power doesn't necessarily mean changing the system.
Thank you, Cassie, and sorry about the challenges with the microphones, but I'll just briefly repeat for the benefit of people on the live stream. So we have one question about philanthropy and social movements and best practice in philanthropy funding social movements. Question about effective altruism as the latest fad, following on from maybe philanthrocapitalism and some of the critiques around that, and question about actually not just tactical changes but more fundamental ones to the way that we just live and function in terms of the power in philanthropy. So would you like to go first, Fozia? You can respond to any or all of the three.
I'll start off with the one about social movements, because I think that's really interesting. And I'm going to go back in history because Rhodri and I just love history, and there's a fund that we both love called the Rosenwald Fund, which was set up in the 1920s in America, and it was a fund which was, the aim of it was to empower a whole generation of black people in America through education. 8,000 schools were created across the South, but as well as that, and this brings me to the point, the Rosenwald Fund funded individuals who thought were key influences in building a movement. People like Maya Angelou, people like Ralph Emerson, they received funding as individuals to push the civil rights movement forward. So I think we need, as philanthropy, to recognise that movements are built by people. They're not built by institutions. I can't think of any really serious, complex movement over the last few years which has been led by, Save the Children or Oxfam or whatever else.
But firstly, which philanthropies are actually funding those individuals today?
There are. So in America, there are, particularly if you look at the racial justice funds, there are a number of racial justice funds where they are funding, traditionally awarding grants to grantees, but they are also funding scholarships and placements and just the work of individuals, and to enable them to push forward the movement and the agenda. So it is happening. It's not on a huge scale, but I think the most progressive foundations in the US, particularly in relation to racial justice, are now starting to fund individuals.
And would you like to comment on any of the other two?
I'll pass those on.
Rhodri.
You can come back to me if you need to.
Just on the funding movements one, actually just picking up on what Fozia was saying, there was a really fascinating story the other day about two anonymous donors from a tech background in Chicago, I think, who had funded an intermediary organisation that focused around issues to do with defunding the police, but they hadn't put any restrictions on the grant. So the organisation used a little bit of it for its own kind of intermediary cost, and then passed on about 80 or 90% of it in the form of very small grants to individuals focusing around issues of racial justice and kind of black-led and minority-led organisations. And I thought that was a fascinating example because it kind of highlighted some of the things you have to do. I think there has to be a very high degree of humility on the part of the donor to start with. I think there has to be a pretty fundamental shift in your expectations of whether or not you're going to get gratitude for it, because I think when you're funding social movements as a donor, chances are you probably aren't. Like, at best, people will take your money, but they'll probably say, well, about time too. I've heard some pretty amazing stories about how those meetings have gone. And the other thing I think is that having intermediaries, and this goes, I think, to some of what Joe was saying earlier, can be really important because it just allows the balance of risk in those relationships to be tilted so that you have an organisation that can speak to the donors and make them comfortable with what's happening, but who can also credibly talk to organisations right on the sort of forefront of these things that might have tactics and views on things that donor is never going to be comfortable with, but they can kind of manage that relationship and allow those risk profiles to be matched up. I just quickly say I'll just touch on the EA one because that was directed at me. I would absolutely agree. I think in the same way that philanthrocapitalism was absolutely a doctrine of the status quo, it was about making people feel as though the way to solve problems was to kind of maximise the amount of money you make in the existing systems and structures we have, and just leave those systems and structures untouched. EA is also that, in that it focuses very much on maximising the amount of good you can do in the world, but not thinking about things at a structural level. And it turns out the answer to most of the problems in society are allowing a very small, exceedingly white group of graduates from a small handful of elite universities to dictate what those are. The amount of intellectual hubris in that movement is staggering. There is a lot of good that's come out of it, but I think they've come around to sort of realising that. What happens when these things go wrong? I think this is where it does really help to have a historical perspective, because I feel one of the things about EA is, again, it's remarkably unaware of where it sits in the longer history of philanthropy, and I think it feels as though it is unique and unprecedented, and it isn't. I mean, the idea of trying to impose some form of rationality and make giving more effective and considered and scientific is as old as the hills. And every time we have this and eventually it goes wrong, we take the good bits from it and they become sort of absorbed into the mainstream, and then we let the charity organisation movement or scientific philanthropy, those as terms, go by the wayside in the same way as philanthrocapitalism and potentially effective altruism will. That's kind of what I think, anyway.
And if you want more historical perspective on philanthropy, check out the hashtag for literacy. It's got lots more historical coverage from Rhodri. Joe, just bringing you in here, is that an experience you found with your pooled fund, that actually you're able to have conversations with some of the people you're giving grants to that maybe your donors give you license to, but maybe couldn't have themselves when you're trying to rethink the economy?
I think I wouldn't put it in quite those terms, but I think what is true is that for the donors that are contributing to Partners for New Economy, they sort of see us as the vehicle, but whereby they can make the grants that they might not be able to make in their own investment committees or board structures. So the kind of risky stuff is put to Partners for a New Economy. And I think that is a helpful kind of mechanism for them. And then obviously, we're doing a range of different things. And so, any individual grant, I mean, we have some that are obviously edgier than others.
What are you most excited about for 2023 in terms of that edginess?
I adore the funding that we give to Kate Rayworth's Donut Economics Action Lab, and it's been going there for 2 or 3 years, and they've also got plans on how does that actually, what's the next horizon for that. But then also some of the narrative work that we're doing through a fellowship through an organisation called Culture Hack, which it's truly global. It is truly kind of intersectional in the widest possible sense. Looking at how inequality and economic issues dovetail with environmental issues and climate issues and all sorts of different social injustices, and in a holistic kind of worldview sense. I mean, it's really quite different to the kind of mainstream, which I think is exciting.
And reflects well on the foundations that they are willing to.
Absolutely. It was certainly one of the grants that I took to my board, unsure whether or not we would go for it, and I was really delighted that they did. One person who I would recommend on the movements issue, who we heard from, was Professor Harry Hahn in the US. She works at Johns Hopkins University, and she has done huge amounts of studying, particularly US focused, but on what makes a successful movement. So what are the kind of identifiers you might look for? Because I think the challenge with funding movements is it's not going to be driven by the funder, but then how do you make a choice of which movements to put your money into? I mean, there's, you can, I think there's a huge amount in trust-based philanthropy, and yet there's also decisions to be made, so you need to have some kind of mechanisms to do that. And just on the kind of effective altruism stuff, I mean, to me, the biggest flaw in that whole agenda is the idea, as you were describing it, that it doesn't really matter how you make your money because you're going to do good with it. I mean, that is just the most fundamental problem, because actually we know that we have an economic system where huge costs go unaccounted for. And if you do not therefore make your money in a responsible way, you are imposing massive costs on society in terms of whether it's you're not paying your workers properly, you're not paying your taxes properly, you're imposing huge costs on the environment. The starting point should be acting responsibly. If you want to do good, act responsibly, and if you can make money in a way responsibly doing that, great. If you then want to give it away, but I definitely, I think that is, to me, feels always like one of the questions also about those endowed foundations. What are you doing with your investments? Are they in tune with the organisations that you're making grants to, or if you're an environmental grant maker, are you funding fossil fuels on one hand with your investments, and then managing to give a bit of money to those campaigning, against new oil exploration on the other. I mean, it's not always consistent. And then the final thing I would just say is, I think there is something where obviously a lot of philanthropic money is made through business, and so that mindset often can permeate that attitude is the right way to think about giving. And I just think what you're trying to achieve with philanthropy is often more complex, and it might work if you were trying to find out what is the most effective way to deliver a vaccine program in X number of countries, and there's some inputs to that you can identify, and there's some way in you can scale that, and you can have some confidence about what it's going to achieve. But when you're trying to tackle racism, I mean, if you were funding the Black Lives Matter movement 4 years ago, you might be sitting there as a funder going, well, what is happening? Right? And then suddenly in 2020, it's everywhere, but it's not everywhere because it was suddenly everywhere. It's everywhere because it had investment. There was infrastructure that was built. There were people who were doing work. There were individuals who were enabled to do that work, probably not enough, who therefore had, a paid role somewhere in which they were able to do it. And I think that is one of the most significant things I feel in terms of our new economy work in the field building. Obviously, the individual work that people do is important, but also there's a huge benefit in these people who are passionate about this issue being able to work on that issue. Even if the particular thing they work on this year is not successful, they might still be in 3 or 5 years' time going on to do something else, which is absolutely stunning and makes all the difference. But if they now felt they had to go and get a job in a bank or in marketing or whatever, then we would lose that person potentially from that movement. So and sometimes I think within philanthropists can forget the basics. People need to live, they need jobs, and if you want a sector to succeed, you need people to be able to earn a living doing it.
Thank you. I can really see the passion, which surprised me given you're a former business minister, but you were looking at...
I was always a fan of responsible business and greater transparency in corporate governance, because I think there's obviously a place for business, but business should be responsible, right? I mean, the whole idea of corporate social responsibility, well, I mean, if a business isn't being responsible, and it isn't being social, what is it? It's basically antisocial. Businesses are part of our community, and actually so much philanthropy comes from businesses that properly took on board that view of how business should be. If you think about many of the Quaker businesses and so on, right? That's where the roots are. Yeah.
Let's come for some more questions. Please raise your hands if you've got your back and front, and one more.
This one.
Sorry.
See it.
Hi. Yeah. Do you want to start? We'll start with you. Hi.
So it's so wonderful to be here, and I think historically one isn't invited to discussions where I guess we're being transparent, we're open and discussing. And I think I find myself from Women's Inclusive Team, by the way, which is a charity based in East London. So often people that look like me are on the menu, were being discussed, but not around the table. So it's wonderful to be around the table and have, I guess, contribute to that. And I think for me, when we talk about trust, which is a big area, I think it's about representation, it's about giving people equal tools, it's about being transparent in terms of who we give those resources to. And I think the more transparency in terms of representation, what does that look like in terms of people that we give resources to, and also people that are the face of those people that hold the resources, and it is ultimately power. But it's also allyship to charities that are doing some really good work that's key and important. And I think for me, just to reflect on during COVID, where I guess people that had the resources saw that there was a problem, so there was COVID, and that was quite clear, we could not avoid that. And then we also saw Black Lives Matter. And from that, I guess we were given resources to be able to respond, resources as and when we needed it, and we produced some amazing work as a charity, to the point that we actually won a Queen's Award for the work that we did, and not because we did anything extra, we had the resources to do more and go the extra mile, which is really important. So I think there is a balance about, not making it too hard for a charity to apply and have access to those resources. And of course, there's a balance with that, making sure that, scrutiny is there, because it is ultimately money that one has to be accounted to. So tools are really important, and making sure that we have the tools to help ourselves, so it doesn't have to look fantastic and beautiful from a funder's perspective, because it's what we currently want to do, but actually from a charity perspective, we see the challenge on the ground, and when we have resources that are unrestricted, we're able to respond to those challenges. But often what funders look at, and people that have the resources, they look for evidence and data and so on, and it takes a bit of time. So by the time you get data and evidence, you know, we're already suffering, and there's things about us being proactive in that. And so I think definitely for me, what I want to kind of see is making sure that we are involved in deciding what our future is, and actually how can we make sure that trust is, you know, that you trust us equally to be able to solve our own problems.
Thank you. And at the back.
Hi, my name's Will Thong. I'm a Major Gifts Officer at the Labour Party. I was actually wanting to ask another question about effective altruism, but specifically about the reputation washing that goes along with it, because his reputation collapsed along with his wealth. He claimed to be a vegan and he was having steaks delivered to his house like pretty much every day. It's like quite funny actually, but obviously quite tragic as well for the organisations that he funded. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about charity's role in washing the reputation of people who clearly are doing it in order to become acceptable members of society. And I think in SBF's case it was, you know, trying to make a load of money while appearing to be a good person. What's the ethical role of the charity in allowing those people to do harm and then wash their reputations afterwards?
Thank you. And
thank you. Is this one that works? Or doesn't? It works. Thank you. Just to your point about movements, I used to be the fundraising director for XR in 2018-2019, and there's also a representative from Fridays for Future here as well. So if anyone has any questions around that, I'm more than happy to answer them. I'm here wearing a couple of different hats today as intermediaries from a non-profit Climate 2025 and a new charity called the Movements Trust. And we specifically exist to help the philanthropic community respond to the grassroots groups and social movements. And there was something you were saying around having philanthropy centred on justice rather than charity. And one of the really interesting things that I'm working on with Fozia is taking that one step further and thinking about reparative philanthropy and really thinking about where money is coming from, the roots of different money, who's creating the problems, who is suffering from the problems. And one of the things within movements that we've noticed, particularly there's a global north, global south divide, is a lot of people from that we met in Egypt at COP, they want to accept money from foundations like BP, like BMW, like that are extractivist. They've made their money from extractivist sources, but the situation is so dire that, you know, they need this money. There needs to be a safe way to get money from A to B. And so I guess my question is, how far will it take to move philanthropy to that like reparations kind of space? And I guess just from a practical perspective, I'm trying to build grant agreements that help protect those extractivist foundations, corporate foundations, to be able to give without it being greenwashing, and then for movements to be able to receive without it looking, I don't know, ironic or... yeah, just love your opinion.
Three brilliant questions and contributions. Before we just get final comments from the panel, do you want to come in from Fridays to the Future just to explain exactly what you're about, what you've been doing? It'd be great to hear.
Hi, thank you so much. So I'm part of Fridays for Future Kenya, and we're a movement. I work with a lot of grassroots youth, and one of the challenges that we face is getting resources. You know, having a movement is great, but I also have a lot of youth who come in and they need resources to make a difference in the communities. Now, sadly, because we're from Africa, you know, we're the global south, we don't get so much attention, we don't get so much resources, and our counterparts in the global north, they're the ones who are always given priority over us. So we want to change this, and when you're engaging with movements, please consider people like us who are at the grassroots and doing important work in our communities as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for what you're doing, and a double challenge of funding social movements, but not just in our own country, but elsewhere. Let's have some closing remarks. We'll come to you first, Luba. I'm sorry I didn't bring you into some of the questions before, but if there's any closing comments you want to make, having listened to some of the discussion, make them now, and then we'll just have a half a minute each from the others.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was listening to the questions, and the main idea of these ethical principles of philanthropy and whether you can or cannot take the money from this other side was the following for us and for other organizations as we had this discussion. So the idea is that you cannot help greenwash someone, and for us, if you want to know whether your funder want to provide this support or whatever, some of the organizations were getting anonymous funds, so they used them, but they never talked about those philanthropies or whatever. And in Ukraine, we have this problem that whatever business start their foundation or philanthropy activity or a family foundation, whatever, it means that you are trying to cover some of your sins in the past. People, it's the mindset that people do not trust those that have enormous tons of money. It's something that we are trying to think that they are trying to solve some of their problems and then get to heaven someday. But from our point of view, we were, and some of you talked through it before, that we need to have this excellence within the sector, how we do our work and what are the our principles, ethics, and so on. And so even though we're not at the stage where we can help to do it all by ourselves, but we need to have these politics or rules for us within the organization or within the sector, within the country. It depends on what level we are talking about, to create these main rules to follow. And these are transparency, these are where the money goes, these are the conflict of interest within the organization, good governance, and so on. And for example, talking about the money that was raised to help Ukraine, I was trying to get some information how these organizations spend them. And there is no public reports right now. Maybe they are, but they are hidden. And as humanitarian outcomes reported the report in May 2022, how they collected the money and how they spread, it was that Ukrainian local organization received only 0.0001% of the whole amount of money. And since then, no report at all. They were highly criticized, and they just shut down this small door with opportunity to get this inside information. And this is something that we need to know. We are trying to get this information from the grassroots, and they're trying to collect it and then to show it. But we also need to get this information from the grant makers, from philanthropists, and from the donors if they want to live in the same landscape, in the same system as we all do.
Thank you, and clearly appreciate your efforts to improve greater transparency. An issue in the UK as well. We should remember that some of the sanctioned Russian oligarchs have funded quite a lot of the UK's non-profit sector until they were sanctioned. Brief comments, just in closing, we've only just got a minute left. Fozia first, then Rhodri and Jafar.
What can you say in a minute that's meaningful? I mean, I think all 3 points and questions that were raised by the final session were really, really important, and the thread that links them all is in relation to power, and that lies fundamentally at the heart of the system that we're in. I come back to my original starting off point, which is philanthropy is power, and in relation to recognising that, recognising a reparative approach to justice. Justice means a reparative approach because justice means that you acknowledge history. You cannot move forward without acknowledging history and then making an effort to address injustice from the past. And I think the approach that the Joseph Rowntree Trust took in relation to their history, I think is a good example where they investigated, they explored, they acknowledged. So that first part in terms of acknowledging what has been the source of your income, the source of your endowment is incredibly important. And then the second part is working with the communities to try and address those historical injustices, which I think for Joseph Grantree involves working with people in the Caribbean who were affected directly by slavery, but also working with generations of people who emigrated from the Caribbean who are suffering injustice today in communities today in the UK. So those are the two fundamental elements for me, is acknowledge the past and then try and devolve power and work with the communities to try and address those historical injustices.
Thank you, Fozia. Rhodri.
I'll try and keep this brief. The question of tainted money is actually my favourite topic in the whole of philanthropy, so it's difficult. But the thing that sort of ties it together, and again I'll just throw in a little bit of history, is this is a question that people have been grappling with for about 2,000 years and more, and there's always been sort of two views on it, which one is the one where it's kind of an absolutist, well obviously if the money is questionable you would soil yourself by accepting that money, so keep your hands clean. And then at the other end of the spectrum you've got the view that I always think is best exemplified by William Booth, who founded the Salvation Army, who said the only problem with tainted money is taint enough of it. And then he also said even more than that, he said he would take money from the devil himself and wash it clean in the tears of widows and orphans, because he was like, just give me any money and I'll have it. But I think the relevance of that in the here and now is it comes down to some quite practical questions about, can you take that money and not taint yourself as an organisation? And then it comes down to questions about power and control. Is the donor setting the parameters by which that money is used? If they are, then it's quite difficult because they're retaining power. Are they getting reputational benefit from it? It's always interesting to me to question whether actually if that donation was anonymous, we normally think that's a no-no, but if the money's tainted and it's coming anonymously, is that actually better in that circumstance? And then finally, I mean there's a lot more to say, but does acceptance of a gift necessarily imply that you condone the donor and their business practices? And the interesting recent example of that, I think, is when Mackenzie Scott gave one of her tranches of gifts, and she's a pretty exemplary donor, she gave one of the gifts to Frida, the Young Feminist Fund, and they took the money, a large amount of money, but they also wrote a very combative blog post where they said, this doesn't mean that we think that what Amazon does is not problematic and the way in which she has accrued her wealth is not problematic. We'll take the money because we are going to do good with it in the world, but that still needs to be addressed. And I think that kind of points the way to a potential future for movements, which again goes to that question of gratitude, is can you take the money and at the same time say, well, I still don't condone that donor? It takes quite an enlightened donor, that has to be said, but it can be done.
Jo, last word.
I think the two questions here just were sort of beautifully juxtaposed there. So, will and the reputation washing, and yet the challenge of, the young movements in COP who are saying, are we going to take money from BP? And the thing I would say is, I don't think we should be judging the youth movements that are probably, it's not going to stop them speaking against BP anyway, I would imagine. I think there possibly is a different answer if you're talking about major art institutions that might have other routes to be able to get funding and probably employ somebody for that purpose and so on. So I definitely think there are some institutions for which that's a very, very relevant question that they should be asking. And then just this other point about reparative philanthropy. I mean, I feel in the UK and across Europe we are actually very far behind the debate in the US. I think that we sort of like to almost comfort ourselves in thinking, well, yes, there's racism, but it's worse in America. But actually, I don't think we can really say that. And the story that we sort of tell ourselves, certainly from a British perspective about empire, is so far from the reality that we don't really acknowledge the essence of the wealth of our own country, and therefore we're actually much philanthropic wealth. And obviously it's not all that case, but where much of it comes from. One of our grantees, Open Democracy, recently did a great film on this with Koja Karam and John Barnes, the footballer, and it centres on Liverpool, and it sort of weaves together all of the challenges of it, looking at through the lens of the city there. And I just think we need more of that. We need more to actually be honest about that story. I definitely hope we can get to that position where we start to think about reparative funding, but I think there's probably quite a lot of kind of cultural understanding that we actually need to go through to get there.
Thank you. I hope that answer went some way to answering the questions. And with that, we're going to have to wrap up. I'm really sorry for running over. I think we could have gone on for a lot longer, but any fault and lack of discipline with the timekeeping is my own. For people on the live stream, thank you for joining us. There'll be a video you'll receive of the event next week via email and a write-up together with details of a discounted subscription. But everyone here in the room at Aga Khan, there's tea and coffee now, and in 20 minutes' time we'll be starting some workshops. So we'll be looking at the year in philanthropy through the prism of our 4 special features I mentioned earlier. Andrew Milner, if you can put your hand up, our features editor, depending on what issue of Alliance you have. This is the latest one with a feature on crisis, so it'll be here, and so on. But we'll see you in 15 minutes. Just with that, just want to thank Liubov, Joe, Rhodri and Fozia for fantastic contribution. Thank you very much for that's our year in philanthropy. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was brilliant, really. Yeah, sorry, only briefly discussed on things. Thank you for stepping in. Brilliant. Right, half an hour later. I'm sure it's only been 2 years.